Somewhere in a server room in Redmond, Washington, a decision was made that would quietly end the life of nearly 240 million computers. Not because they broke, not because they got infected with a virus, not because anything was wrong with them at all. They were declared obsolete by a memo. Picture the machine sitting in your home right now. It boots up fine. It opens your email. It runs the same programs it ran 5 years ago. By every measure that should matter, it works. And yet, according to Microsoft, as of October 2025, that machine is now a liability, a risk, something to be replaced. The official reason given was security. A new chip requirement called TPM 2.0, think of it as a tiny digital lock built into the motherboard, a lock most computers built before 2017 simply don't have. Without it, Microsoft says, your computer cannot be trusted to run Windows 11. But here's the question. Almost nobody is asking out loud. If this was truly about protecting people, why did the company that demanded this chip also spend years trying to block the free tools that let people bypass it? That question has an answer. And the answer reaches back further than Windows 11, further than TPM chips, further than 2021. It reaches all the way back to a contract signed in 1980 and a pattern that has repeated itself almost mechanically in every decade since. Stick around, because once you see this pattern, you will recognize it in nearly every piece of software you have ever been forced to use. To understand what happened to your computer in 2025, you have to go back to a deal struck in 1980 when IBM needed software for what would become the first major home computer. They turned to a small, unproven company run by a young man named Bill Gates. IBM assumed they were simply buying a piece of software outright. They were wrong. Buried in the contract was a clause allowing Gates's company to sell that same operating system to anyone else who wanted it. When IBM's machines took off, every competitor needed the same software just to keep up. Almost overnight, one company's product became the default setting for an entire industry. That default setting is the most valuable real estate a company can ever own. Once people expect your product, you don't have to keep earning their business. They simply assume there's no alternative. For years, that assumption was actually deserved. Old-timers remember Windows XP and later Windows 7 as machines that simply worked. Clean. Quiet. No pop-ups demanding your attention. No surprise software installing itself while you weren't looking. The monopoly existed, but it behaved itself because the company still depended on people choosing to stay. Then, in 2014, a new chief executive named Satya Nadella took the wheel. And whatever loyalty the previous era of Microsoft owed, its longtime customers quietly expired. This is where a term coined by writer and technologist Cory Doctorow becomes essential. He calls it end-shitification, a clinical description of how platforms decline in 3 predictable stages. First, a company is genuinely good to its users because it needs them to stay. Second, once those users are locked in, the company starts squeezing them slightly to benefit its business partners. Third, once even the business partners are dependent, the company squeezes everyone, clawing back every last bit of value for itself. Notice that none of this requires the company to be incompetent. Quite the opposite. It explains how it unfolds in online platforms in 3 easy steps, and the unsettling part is how deliberately each step has to be engineered. Nothing about Windows 11 happened by accident. It happened on schedule. Here's where the open question from the very first chapter gets its first real answer. Why would a company suddenly need to convince hundreds of millions of people their computers were unsafe? Look at where Microsoft's money actually comes from today. Windows, the product that built the entire company, the operating system whose name still appears on every box and every login screen, now makes up less than 10% of Microsoft's total revenue. It is shrinking every year relative to everything else they sell. That single fact changes everything about how to read Windows 11. Alibaba Microsoft does not need Windows to be good anymore. They need Windows to be a doorway into something that actually makes them money. Cloud computing, artificial intelligence subscriptions, and a constant stream of new hardware sales flowing to their partners at Dell, HP, and Lenovo. The first real warning sign came years before Windows 11, in fact, with Windows 8. Anyone who used a desktop computer back then remembers being greeted with a tile-covered start screen better suited to a tablet, shoving advertisements and links to Microsoft's own App Store in front of every single user before they could reach their own desktop. This is classic step 2 of the platform decay process, making the user experience worse to serve third-party business interests. But back then, Windows still mattered too much to the company's bottom line to push things too far. They backed off. They restored the familiar Start menu. The leash was still on. That leash came off entirely once cloud computing exploded. Microsoft began buying computer chips by the truckload, building enormous data centers, and renting that computing power back to companies, including the very same artificial intelligence startups now flooding the market. Demand grew so explosively that in a single, recent 3-month period, revenue from those data centers jumped by 33%. Windows, meanwhile, kept shrinking as a share of the business. And once something becomes small enough inside a giant company, nobody at the top is losing sleep over whether it's still pleasant to use. June 2021. Microsoft unveils Windows 11 with the kind of polished corporate theater normally reserved for a product nobody could possibly object to. Smooth animations, a friendlier-looking start menu, a tone of total confidence. Then came the requirement that nobody in the audience was prepared for: TPM 2.0. In plain English, a small security chip soldered directly onto a computer's motherboard, acting almost like a digital lock built into the hardware itself, separate from any software that could be removed or replaced. Most computers manufactured before roughly 2017 simply never had this chip installed, because at the time, almost nobody was asking for it. Overnight, with a single technical specification buried in a press release, hundreds of millions of working computers worldwide were sorted into a new and permanent category: incompatible. Not slow, not unsafe in any way anyone could actually point to, just incompatible by decree. Industry analysts have since estimated that as many as 240 million computers could be headed for landfills as a direct result of this single requirement. Sit with that figure for a moment. These are not broken machines being responsibly recycled. These are functioning pieces of property, often paid for in full years ago, declared worthless by a decision made in a boardroom that owes you nothing once the receipt is signed. And this is where the next open question plants itself. One that will get fully answered before this story ends. If the goal was truly to protect as many people as possible, why would the company spend real engineering effort trying to stop free tools that let older computers run Windows 11 safely anyway? A company that wanted maximum security adoption would celebrate that workaround. Instead, Microsoft tried to quietly choke it off. That detail alone should make anyone pause. Here is the trap as it was actually built, laid out in plain terms. Once Windows 10 reached its official end of life on October 14th, 2025, free security updates simply stopped. No patches, no fixes for newly discovered vulnerabilities. Your existing, fully paid-for computer was left exposed by design, not by neglect. Microsoft did offer a way out, dressed up as a kindness: the Extended Security Updates Program, or ESU. For individual households, it works like this: pay $30 once and your existing computer stays protected through October of 2026. 1 single year. After that, the protection runs out again, with no announced path forward for ordinary consumers at all. Businesses face a steeper climb. $61 for year 1. The price doubles to $122 in year 2. It doubles again to $244 in year 3. That is a single device, not a fleet, climbing toward over $400 across 3 years just to keep doing exactly what it was already doing yesterday. But notice the other option Microsoft quietly offers instead of that $30 fee. Skip the payment entirely, they say, if you simply turn on Windows Backup and sign in with a Microsoft account, free of charge. Free in the sense that no money leaves your wallet, not free in any other sense, because what you're actually paying with is your data synced continuously to Microsoft's own servers, the same servers that quietly increased their revenue by 1/3 in a single quarter, fueled directly by the AI boom this company is racing to dominate. The cost was never erased. It was simply converted into something that doesn't show up on a bank statement, but is worth even more to the company collecting it. That's the squeeze. Pay with cash, pay with your privacy, or pay with an entirely new computer. 3 doors, all leading to the same room. This is the moment all those earlier open questions finally connect into a single picture. Windows 11 doesn't simply replace Windows 10. It arrives preloaded with Microsoft's artificial intelligence assistant, Copilot, built directly into the operating system itself, not as an optional download, but as a default presence on the very same machine where private documents, emails, and browsing history all live. Microsoft's own published documentation describes a feature called Recall, capable of capturing regular screenshots of on-screen activity to build a searchable history of what a person has been doing on their own computer. Picture a security camera quietly running inside your own home, except the footage belongs to the company that installed it, not to you. Now, lay the entire timeline side by side, a hardware requirement that instantly orphans hundreds of millions of working machines, a pricing structure engineered to escalate the longer someone resists upgrading, a free alternative to that fee that simply trades cash for personal data instead. And waiting at the very end of that path, a surveillance-capable assistant installed by default on the replacement computer everyone eventually buys. None of these pieces individually proves intent. Together, they describe a machine built with remarkable precision. Hardware partners like Dell, HP, and Lenovo sell a wave of new computers. Microsoft sells the licenses for the operating system running on top of them. Microsoft also sells the AI subscriptions layered on top of that. And the security justification, the one repeated in every official announcement, becomes the perfect cover story, the one explanation that makes an enormously profitable chain of events sound completely unavoidable. This is enshittification completed in its final stage, the one Doctorow describes as the company turning at last on absolutely everyone, customers and former loyalty alike, because by this point in the cycle, there is no one left whose goodwill still needs protecting. Despite everything laid out so far, there remains real but practical agency here, choices the company would rather people not know about. The first is a free tool called Rufus. It allows a person to create a Windows 11 installation drive that quietly bypasses the TPM 2.0 requirement entirely, letting older but perfectly functional hardware run the same operating system Microsoft insists it cannot handle. Microsoft has, at various points, attempted to make this workaround harder to find and harder to use, worth remembering that detail from a few chapters back. A company genuinely focused on maximizing safety would have no reason to discourage a free tool that extends protection to more devices, not fewer. The second path is Linux Mint, a completely free operating system built specifically to feel familiar to anyone coming from Windows, without subscriptions, without an AI assistant scanning activity in the background, and without a corporate parent deciding when the hardware underneath it suddenly stops qualifying. It runs comfortably on older machines that Windows 11 has formally rejected, breathing new life into computers that still have years of useful service left in them. And for anyone who simply needs more time before making a decision, the ESU program remains available as exactly what it is: a bridge, not a destination. $30 buys one additional year. That's a number worth knowing precisely rather than vaguely. None of these options require technical expertise beyond following clear instructions. What they require is knowing that the options exist at all, since the company benefiting from the alternative path is naturally not the one advertising the exit. There's also a deeper question worth sitting with. If a 4-decade pattern of tightening control has played out this consistently across operating systems, browsers, and now artificial intelligence, what does that suggest about where the next squeeze is already being planned? That's a story for another time. Strip away the press releases and the polished launch events, and what remains is a far simpler story than any of it was designed to sound. This was never primarily about security. A company that genuinely prioritized protecting the largest possible number of people would have made the safest option the easiest one to find, not the hardest. It would have welcomed free workarounds rather than working to suppress them. It would not have built a pricing structure that grows more punishing the longer someone hesitates, nor offered a free alternative that simply collects something more valuable than money instead. What actually happened followed a pattern with real history behind it. A monopoly secured decades ago through a single overlooked contract clause, a long, gradual erosion of trust through a process with its own name, enshittification, unfolding in stages, exactly as described, first earning loyalty, then exploiting it. Then exploiting everyone left standing once that loyalty had nowhere else to go. And finally, a fully engineered transition built to convert one company's aging monopoly into ownership over the next one entirely. Artificial intelligence, with surveillance quietly riding along as a permanent passenger on the same operating system computers are now required to run. The genuinely encouraging part of this story is that the outcome was never actually fixed in stone. Tools exist, alternatives exist. Knowledge of how this pattern works, once it's actually understood, is itself a form of leverage that no boardroom decision can simply legislate away. A monopoly only stays a monopoly for as long as people keep believing they have no other option. They were never the only option. They were simply the most convenient one, for exactly as long as that convenience was allowed to remain unquestioned.